Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion on South Asia, and we're going to focus today on Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And with each of these countries, we're going to kind of take a look at the physical geography. We'll dive a little bit into their economics and what their economy looks like, what it's based on, and then we'll talk a little bit about their culture. So again, in this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography, wrapping up South Asia. So in your textbook for my students, the name of this section is Mountain Kingdoms and Island Republics, which is quite fitting. We're going to talk about two that certainly are very dominated by the Himalayas, and then we'll talk about the two island republics. So let's start with Nepal. For U.S. listeners, if you're looking for a comparison, it's about roughly the size of Arkansas. So just to kind of give you some idea. Now, the dominant landscape or the dominant landform in Nepal is the Himalayas. And they cover about 80% of the land. In fact, Nepal is kind of the heart of the Himalayas. In fact, 8 of the 10 largest mountains in the world are located in Nepal, including the very largest, which would be Mount Everest. We'll talk a little bit about the role that those mountains play economically as well in a little bit. But they definitely make up the vast majority of the landscape that you'll find in Nepal. And they tend to dominate the more northern part of the country. The southern part of Nepal is actually quite different. It tends to be a little bit more flat and tends to be a little bit more river plains. And you'll also even see rainforests, which is much more like what you'd find in other Southeast Asian countries or Southern Asian countries. And so you'll see farmland here, you'll see swamps, you'll again also see rainforests. And so when we look at the other parts of the physical geography like climate, it's kind of a tale of two halves. So in the south, you're going to experience more of that humid subtropical climate. So monsoons in the rainy season and those winds and rains during that rainy season are very consistent with this region. However, when you look at the north, that's where you get into the highland climate. And so this is another great example in the world where elevation plays a very important role in climate. And as our elevation gets higher, our temperatures tend to cool. And so even though we find ourselves, in an area of the world that is dominated by warmer temperatures, elevation still continues to play a role. Economically, Nepal is almost entirely reliant upon agriculture. And most of that agriculture tends to happen in the southern part of the country. Rice and sugarcane, as well as wheat and corn and potatoes, are grown. You will see fields, especially in the plains in the south, but you'll also see them terraced on the sides of hills. And certainly this would allow for more agriculture to take place, even though you're seeing a big change in the physical geography. Exports-wise, so similar to like what we saw with Bangladesh, clothing is a big one. You're also going to see carpets coming out of Nepal, and this is certainly makes up the majority of what they're selling to other countries. Imports, not a lot of petroleum reserves, and so gas and oil would be things that would be being imported into Nepal. You're going to see fertilizers. Again, not a lot of chemical development in Nepal, and of course, with agriculture being important, fertilizers also going to be important. And then lastly, machinery. And again, that is to help particularly in agriculture. And there have been actions like deforestation occurring to try to meet those agricultural demands. And with that certainly can come erosion, and certainly also with more fertilizers and pesticides and other chemicals being brought in to help with farming, that can also certainly find its way certainly into the water sources, although not as big of an issue in Nepal as other places around the world. Where Nepal seems to be most greatly affected, and this is again a great example of human-environment interaction, is in floods and mudslides. When you have these, very elevated areas meeting flatter areas, when you see a lot of rain come all at once, like in a monsoon season or in a wet season, that can cause mudslides, especially given the pretty large slope that you can experience with the Himalayas and the other hills that you would find in Nepal. And so these two have unfortunately been quite devastating to this region. To a lesser degree, earthquakes, but certainly these two have been two natural disasters that have greatly affected the people of Nepal. Speaking of the people, population of Nepal today is around 28.61 million people. So for the region, it's actually got a fairly large population, excluding, of course, India and Pakistan. But especially the countries that we're looking at today, it's among the larger ones. The people of Nepal tend to be very closely related to the people of northern India and Tibet. And in particular, among those people is a group that's gained some notoriety as tourism to Nepal has increased. And one of the things that has brought a lot of tourists are mountain climbers in the mountains, the Himalayas, especially the challenge of wanting to say, I climbed Mount Everest. And this group is known as the Sherpa. And the Sherpas serve as guides to mountain climbers in helping them achieve their goals of the variety of different mountains you can climb in the Himalayas, including Mount Everest. Kathmandu is your capital. It's also your largest city. Today we have a parliamentary democracy with elements of a monarchy because the prime minister is appointed by the king of Nepal. And so it's kind of an interesting combination of democracy, but also certainly some monarchy still visible here. Hinduism is your official religion. However, there certainly is a presence of Buddhism here. And Nepal does have a special place in the Buddhist faith because it's believed to be the birthplace of the Buddha. And so certainly has a connection to Buddhism as well. A transition here to Bhutan. So certainly you're going to see the Himalayas continue into Bhutan. And if you're looking for a comparison to, say, the United States, it's about half the size of Indiana. So again, getting to be a little bit smaller here. Again, the Himalayas and also forests tend to dominate the landscape here. And what you'll notice with both Nepal and Bhutan in particular, is that the physical geography, especially in the north of Nepal, but pretty much throughout Bhutan, is that it makes it difficult to build infrastructure. And you end up finding a lot of isolated villages that are largely a little bit more self-sustaining. Now, they'll certainly have things flown in, but it does make it more difficult economically to connect themselves. And that has hurt their economic development as well. Economically, you're going to see most people are subsistence farmers. And just as a reminder, a subsistence farmer, this is somebody who's growing enough food to help feed themselves and their family with maybe just a little bit extra to sell just so that they can continue to feed themselves and their family. You'll see cardamom, you'll see oranges and rice, corn, potatoes, cattle that can live among the mountains, including species like yaks. You'll also see that because it's more difficult to have things like oil and natural gas shipped around the country, that there's been a little bit more adoption of hydroelectric power as a power source because it's available locally. Tourism is also starting to grow here as an industry, especially people wanting to see the mountains and the forests of Bhutan. The people of Bhutan, population-wise, they're about 763,000. And that number has begun to decrease in recent years. This is a great example of a country that hasn't had, the influx of immigrants to their country, and you've seen this trend of smaller families, people having fewer kids, and that has led to their population decreasing over time. Most people here speak a language that's known as Jangha or Dzongkha, and they tend to live in rural villages. Thimphu, is the capital. Religion-wise, one of the things that has begun to help with tourism is the presence of the dzongs, which are Buddhist centers for prayer as well as study. And so it has brought some tourism certainly to this region to see these beautiful temples. But you have had Buddhists from around the world come to pray here, to study here. Government-wise, you have a king who shares power with the elected officials. So certainly these mountain kingdoms, you do still have kings who still have influences, but you are seeing more influences from elected officials in both Nepal as well as Bhutan. Sri Lanka is our third country. It's an island off the southeast coast of India. And physical geography, it's a good mixture of beaches, which is going to be economically quite important, as well as forests and highlands. And so certainly infrastructure-wise, you can see from the image here, you've got trains that have certainly make their way through those highlands as well as through the forests. Climate-wise, mostly tropical climates. You're going to see certainly a wet and a dry season. During that wet season, you'll experience monsoons with, again, that heavy rain and wind, bringing large amounts of rain all at once. Economically, again, very based in agriculture. You're going to see rice, tea. You'll see rubber as well as coconuts. They're also known for their sapphires, their rubies, and their gemstones, and those do tend to come from the highland regions. Certainly the forests also bring in economic activity, including ebony wood as well as satin wood. And they are beginning to see more industry. You're going to see textiles growing in this region, fertilizers, cement, leather, of course, the wood industry still continuing, and then also in the service industries like insurance and banking. The people of Sri Lanka, you'll see important coastal cities and trade ports like the capital of Colombo. And in 1948, about a year after India, Sri Lanka gained its independence from British rule. Today, they're a republic where the prime minister is the head. Population-wise, they're about 21.8 million people. And ethnically, they're largely made up of two groups. The Sinhalese, which make up about 3/4, 74%, and they tend to be mostly Buddhist. And then the Tamils. And the Tamils make up about 18%. So again, these are two of the largest ethnic groups. But the Tamils tend to be Hindus. And these two ethnic groups really, for about 20 years and up until about 2001, were at war with each other, which caused a lot of instability in Sri Lanka. You've seen some of that stabilization in the last 20 years as this is being recorded in 2021. But certainly that did set them back, that kind of internal fighting within Sri Lanka. I want to wrap up today with the Maldives. So when we look at the physical geography, they're definitely an archipelago. They're a chain of islands, about 1,200, mostly coral islands. And most of them are what we would call atolls, which are low-lying, kind of ring-shaped islands that typically are surrounded by a lagoon, like you guys can see here in the picture, and certainly also has brought a lot of tourism to the Maldives. In fact, probably their most important industry. Of the 1,200, you're only going to see people living on about 200. And the climate here is warm, it's humid. They also experience monsoons, a lot of heavy rain, and of course, a lot of wind. Economically, there's just, for lack of space and soil, or rich soil, there's not a lot of crops grown in the Maldives. And so the two biggest industries are tourism and fishing. And of course, you guys can see from the image here on the right that tourism is a big part of their economy. In fact, it's the largest industry. What attracts people largely are the beaches and specifically the coral reefs. Certainly being all coral islands, there's many beautiful coral reefs to be found in the Maldives. Fishing is also the second largest industry and does help provide an important food resource for the Maldives. Population-wise, they're a little bit smaller than some of the other countries we've talked about. They're right there at about 500,000, about 531,000. Malé is the capital. It's also your largest city. This is a population, though, that is mostly Muslim. And they gained independence from Britain in 1965. And so certainly the British had a lot of influence in this region. But you've also seen the influence of other cultures that have brought faiths like Islam to the region. Today, they are a republic because the traditional ruler in years past lost the throne, and as a result, the people now elect their leaders to the region. And that's going to wrap up our discussion on Southwest Asia. For my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes or filling out your own, and certainly make sure you check out your assignment to kind of help look at these different ideas. For those of you just listening, hopefully we gave you some understanding of these smaller nations in Southern Asia. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.